this computer. That looks good. Here we go. I'm going to set a timer on my phone. So I think we're ready to go now. I can keep tabs of this very long presentation that we're about to do, but we're going to get really in depth and go over some of the finer details of bird identification when it comes to birds of prey. And we're going to talk about the distribution of these birds as well. So we're going to take a look at how to identify these birds, anticipate a little bit more about where you can find them in the Mojave Desert and southern Nevada, and celebrate birds of prey. They have critical importance in our ecosystems. They are they're animals that really influence the ecosystems from a top-down perspective. So they're really influencing a lot of our smaller animals, and animals, of course, influence our plant communities. So monitoring and keeping tabs on raptor populations is a very important thing to do for science. It allows us to really gauge the health of our ecosystems. And just a little bit of background to start. I started to do hawk watches back in Florida when I lived in the Miami area. I would go down to the Florida Keys Hawk Watch, and I was one of the hawk watchers down there. And I also began to do point counts across the Western United States around that same time period. So I was kind of bouncing around between Florida and the Western United States, going to places like Big Bend National Park, Colorado, and Wyoming. And eventually I ended up here in southern Nevada doing work on renewable sites. So areas that were being surveyed for renewables, as well as areas that already had been constructed for a renewable energy source, usually solar, but also a little bit of wind. And I've had the opportunities to work with birds of prey in Southern California, Utah, Southern Nevada, parts of New Mexico, Arizona, and might be forgetting another state in there, but 7 or 8 states across the West. And we're going to look at our classic different groups of birds of prey. We're going to look at Buteos, so this includes your red-tailed hawk. We're going to look at accipiters, which are very tricky birds to identify in the field, but we have many of them here in the Las Vegas Valley. We'll look at both species of eagles that occur in the Mojave Desert, the osprey, 4 species of falcons, and harriers. I did not include any kites because we don't regularly get kites, but other parts of North America, you can run into Mississippi kites and swallow-tailed kites. But before we get into any of this, we need to sort of look at the different modes or modalities of bird identification. So I kind of break them up into 5 different things, and I will do these for all bird species. And especially at our beginning birding events, I like to go over these. I think that they can be really helpful. And even if you have been birding for a long time, I think it's really good to take a look at these. So first of all, we have our setting. We have the context in which we're observing or detecting a bird. So that includes the time of year and the season and our habitat. So for us right now, we're in December. It is functionally wintertime. And depending on where you live, you might be living in an urban area. Maybe you're in a rural area. Maybe you're up on in the Spring Mountains where you have coniferous forest. That will be your setting. And you already have a distinct advantage when you are aware of the birds that can show up in that setting at any given time. So if I were to be in the Great Basin Desert in the middle of wintertime, I would be anticipating that the birds that would show up would not be birds that I would expect in Florida in the summertime. You'll get a different set of birds. We have our 3 S's. We have our size, our structure, and our shape. We'll get into that big time. Behavior, what does it look like it's doing? How is it acting? We have our plumage and our field marks. This is not as high of a priority with birds of prey as other groups of birds. When you're looking at warblers, for example, you're really looking at your field marks of warblers. It's actually kind of impossible to tell what you're looking at when you're looking at warblers, if you're not able to see a lot of the coloration, the patterning, the field marks. But with birds of prey, you're actually putting a lot more emphasis and weight on the size, structure, and shape, and a little less on plumage, although we'll see a lot of helpful plumage marks. Vocalizations. Sounds are often diagnostic, meaning that when a bird makes a sound, usually it is particular to that bird. So it is helpful when you do hear the bird. And breeding usually begins for a lot of birds of prey actually in late winter, so a little bit earlier than other bird species and families. So golden eagles, for example, they might start being territorial in January and nest building in February, and they might have young by March. So that's a little earlier than other birds. And when they begin to get territorial, they're vocalizing a lot. So you might not hear golden eagles for most of the year, but by late winter you could. Birders like to name the birds that they're seeing or detecting, observing, hearing. It's not necessary to enjoy the birds, of course, but many birders and definitely scientists really need to do this, especially when trying to figure out exactly what it is that you are seeing for the sake of the scientific project that you're on. So I like to think of bird identification and raptor identification as collecting puzzle pieces. You're collecting these pieces and you're putting them together. Maybe you don't need a lot of pieces to get a full image, but that is how I like to think about it. And do this long enough and you will start to gain an intuition for this. You'll be able to effortlessly identify the birds that you are coming across. Know before you go. Familiarize yourself with the habitats that you're in. So for us, we have Mojave Desert. So these are the big basins with creosote and burr sage. Maybe you have some Joshua trees as you gain a little elevation. For folks that are up in central and northern Nevada, you're in the Great Basin Desert, so a lot more sagebrush. Then there are woodland edges, forest interior, where you might run into northern goshawks, coopers, and sharp-shinned hawks, which you wouldn't necessarily run into a falcon in the middle of the forest, maybe over the forest, but not within it. Riparian areas and wetlands, that's where you might find red-shouldered hawks. There are grasslands and agricultural areas. And if you are near or over open water, you might be running into ospreys or bald eagles. And as a reminder, during migration, so in the spring and the fall, birds will pass through many habitats. And there's always that chance that something like a broad-winged hawk, something that is found much farther east, could show up. We usually get one or two in the Las Vegas Valley every spring, but rare birds make up very little in our bird detection. So they're not something that we're going to emphasize today. So I was just saying that the birds of prey will migrate through different areas and utilize different habitats. And what you're looking at here on the left-hand side is a topographic map of the state of Nevada. And you can see all of these wrinkled lines. It almost looks like a blanket that has not been smoothed out, running over the top of the state of Nevada. And what you're looking at are all of these ranges that are running roughly north to south in orientation. And between them, you have these big sweeping valleys. And that's why Nevada is known as the Basin and Range. You have these big, tall mountains that are running north-south with these big basins in between. And birds of prey will be migrating typically north and south along these north-south oriented ridges. And they have to cross these valleys in between. Typically, they're not using those valleys if they're full of sagebrush or creosote when they're migrating, but they do like to stop into areas that have water, riparian areas. So places like Clark County Wetlands Park is a very popular place to look for birds of prey because they're oftentimes utilizing the cottonwoods and the willow groves, for example. On the right-hand side, you have a list, or excuse me, a map of different Hawkwatch sites that Hawkwatch International monitors. We have one in northeastern Nevada, that's the Go Shoots, and that's a great place to go in the fall to see migratory birds. And then there is one on the south rim of the Grand Canyon and Red Rock Audubon. Chapter members actually went down there in early October to witness some of the migration at the Grand Canyon. So getting a little bit more refined and looking at some of those modalities, we have our 3 S's, our size, our shape, and our structure. Good things to remember is that things are relative, and size is tough to gauge unless you have something nearby for reference. And so we'll take some looks at when bird wings size or tail size are relative, and can be a little confusing, but it all actually kind of depends on the grouping of that bird of prey. I'll give you an example real soon. And at the end of the day, you want to be familiar with the size and the shape because you may not get looks at the plumage. You might have a distant bird, and all you get is the shape, the behavior, the structure, and not a lot of plumage. Some things to look at in behavior. Check out how the bird is moving around. Is it soaring, meaning that it's going around in circles trying to gain some elevation? Is it kiting or hovering in place? Only a few birds are able to do that. So if you see a bird that is kiting or hovering, as if it's sort of suspended by an invisible string staying in place, well, that's kiting. That's when a bird is sort of motionless or stationary, facing the wind, but not moving backwards or forwards. Only a few do that, like the golden eagle and the red-tailed hawk, kestrels, and of course the kites, which we're not going over. Take a look at the cadence or the rhythm of the way that the bird flaps. So something like a northern harrier, we'll get to this bird. It looks like it's bouncing a basketball up and down, whereas a peregrine falcon looks like it's sort of like cracking a whip, just the way that it moves its wrist around. So there are ways in which that they flap that look very different from one another. Notice how the bird is circling. If it is a tight circle, it's probably a smaller bird, and a larger bird like an eagle has very wide circles. Okay, so behavior and your size, structure, these are the things to really look at. All right, let's dive into some of these birds now. This here is your benchmark bird. This is one of our most widespread species across North America. They get all the way into Central America, all the way up to Alaska, and even in the West Indies. This is a bird that's species name is Buteo jamaicensis because it was actually probably first described on the island of Jamaica. And it's an incredibly variable bird. So this is one of those instances where it's really good to familiarize yourself with a couple features on the bird that are unchanging, that are always there, but also the size and the structure. So looking at this bird here, this is a really rufous-toned western subspecies of red-tailed hawk. You're likely to experience this bird. This is one that Preeti Schatzman photographed at the Grand Canyon back in the fall. And look at the wings of this bird. They're quite wide, and it actually looks like the backs of the wings are fusing into the tail. They almost kind of run into one another. And I'm going to show you a couple more hawks where that's not the case. The red-tailed hawk almost looks like it's a bodybuilder of a bird. It's a really thick bird with really wide wings. And it has 3 field marks that you can almost always rely on to be visible. So you have this dark patagium, and the dark patagium is this dark bar that runs from the the bend in the wing all the way to the shoulders. That's called the patagium. You have a breast band. So this one is actually kind of weakly marked. Some birds, it's really obvious, but right down the center of the torso, you have some streaking, and that's the breast band. And then you have these wrist commas. So just below this area, let me use my mouse, just below this area, this is your wrist, and below the wrist, you have these wrist commas. That's a dark mark. And a juvenile red-tailed hawk like this one will not have a red tail. Only adults have those red tails. But as you can see on this juvenile bird, you can still see that dark patagium. You can still see that breast band, and you can see the dark wrists. So those wrist commas are all there on this red-tailed hawk, photographed at Bosque del Apache a couple of years ago. And here's a red-tailed hawk with a pocket gopher and a Cooper's hawk chasing it. I photographed these birds maybe only 2 weeks ago at Sunset Park. And a couple slides ago, I mentioned that size can be relative. So the red-tailed hawk is a larger bird than the Cooper's hawk by a couple inches. The Cooper's hawk is smaller, but the Cooper's hawk has a relatively long tail. And you'll hear relative a lot in birding, because usually you're comparing a bird's shape to something else, like your benchmark bird, the red-tailed hawk. So they actually have similarly sized tails, but the Cooper's hawk has a tail that is longer in proportion to its body than a red-tailed hawk. So that's what I mean by relative. And on this red-tailed hawk, this is a young one. You can see that dark patagium, the wrist commas, and definitely a breast band there. Looking at some other Buteos now that we looked at our benchmark bird, the one that you're most likely to run into in most places in North America any time of year, let's look at some that you're less likely to see. So this is a rough-legged hawk. It's not really a common bird in the Mojave, although they do pass through. They're more of a Great Basin species. This is one of the only birds in North America that actually has feathered tarsi, meaning that it has feathers that go all the way down its legs to about its feet. And that's because this is an Arctic bird of prey, and they spend their entire lives in very cold regions, usually in areas with lots of snow, and so they need that extra insulation. They need the extra feathers running down the tarsi. On this bird, you can see that it doesn't really have a breast band, but it has more of a bib, and it has those wrist commas. But when you get to the patagium, it's kind of dark, but not solid like on a red-tailed hawk. And you have on the tail there, you have one sort of bar that runs across the end of the tail. So you have one single tail band. Getting back to our red-tailed hawks and the structure, that red-tailed hawk again, look at how large and wide the inner wings are. It almost looks like they're bodybuilding birds, those red-tailed hawks. That's a bird on the left. The rough-legged hawk is a lot more dainty. It's a lot more thin-winged and a lot more elegant looking. And look at where the tail meets the back of the wings. There's basically very little overlap. A little bit of that might have to do with the angles of these birds and the way that they were taken, but you can see that there's a distinct amount of space between the wings and the tail of this rough-legged hawk. When you see a red-tailed hawk and you familiarize yourself with the structure of that bird, you'll make very few mistakes about that. This is the same bird, the rough-legged hawk, but what I like about this photo is that you can see how small-headed the rough-legged hawk looks and how elegant it looks here. You can see how thin those wings are, relatively long tail. It's a pretty sleek and thin species of Buteo. The range map is on the right. It's actually a little misleading. We don't get rough-legged hawks coming down into southern Nevada all that often. I would say that probably it needs to be adjusted just a little bit. And maybe once you get up into Elko or north of Beatty, you can start to run into them. The ferruginous hawk, we do have these in southern Nevada, especially if you go up into the Moapa and Overton areas, agricultural areas. This is a large buteo. It is a mammal eater like the red-tailed hawk. These ones like to go after prairie dog towns. We don't have any prairie dog towns in southern Nevada, but certainly across the Great Plains and the other deserts like the Great Basin, you can run into prairie dogs. If you see prairie dogs, you should start looking for ferruginous hawks. Look for them there. On these birds, I see no dark patagiums, so along the shoulders, there's no dark bar across there. The bird on the left, that's an adult light morph, and it has these rusty armpits, but the leading edge of the wings are actually white. The tail is completely white on that bird on the left, and on a ferruginous hawk, you're going to see these 3 points of white when you're looking at the wings and the tail. Even from a great distance, you can see how white of a bird the ferruginous hawk is. The bird on the right, that is a juvenile light morph ferruginous hawk. And you can see how long and tapered those wings are. So unlike the red-tailed hawk again, those large bulging inner wings don't go back towards and overlap with part of the tail. I didn't mention this earlier, but when you're looking at birds of prey, it's also really helpful to look at how they hold their wings. Sometimes birds will hold them perpendicular to their body, and then other times it might hold them up towards the sky. And that's called a dihedral. A turkey vulture is a bird that is a bird that is a classic dihedral shape, so that shallow V. And most of our Western raptors have dihedrals to some degree. So it's not as helpful from a distance, but there are some nuances. So if a ferruginous hawk holds their wings in a fairly deep V, red-tailed hawk is in a sort of shallow V. But unlike some of the Buteos in the east that have their wings perpendicular to the body, it's not as helpful to try to figure out if the bird has a dihedral or not. Just wanted to throw that out there, that your Swainsons, your ferruginous, your rough-legged, and your red tails all have that dihedral. Here's a bird from yesterday at Clark County Wetlands Park. Another red-tailed hawk. Compare it to the ferruginous hawk. Again, you can see those markings of that red-tailed hawk. Hopefully you're cueing in on the dark patagiums, the wrist commas, and the breast bands of the red-tailed hawk. It's that combination of three that's important. Here's a range of the ferruginous hawk. This is a Great Plains and desert species. Okay, so a lot of those birds can be found in very open areas, but you have the red-shouldered hawk, which can be found mostly around wetlands and forest edge, especially if there's any water around, you have a good chance of seeing the red-shouldered hawk. Something really interesting has been happening in the last decade or so in southern Nevada, and that is that the red-shouldered hawk has started to show up more and more frequently in the area. This might be because of a changing climate. They may be able to find the preferred foods for longer in the year, and therefore they can hang out during the winter and breed here in the summer. These birds will eat lots of frogs and snakes and even fish in some areas. In Florida, I've seen them eating fish. And so they're usually around wetlands. So we have them at places like Floyd Lamb, Sunset Park. We have them at Clark County Wetlands Park, and certainly the Henderson Bird Viewing Preserve. All along the Las Vegas Wash, you can find these red-shouldered hawks. When they're soaring, these birds look like they're reaching their hands forward, and because their outer wings tend to bulge out, it almost looks as if they're wearing baseball gloves and they're reaching out to catch a ball. So I like to think that they're wearing these baseball mitts. The adults can be really boldly patterned. So you have all of this black and white barring that runs all across the the trailing edge of the wings all the way up into the tips of the wings and the feathers called the primaries. And on an adult bird, it's especially obvious, but you have that black and white alternating pattern on the tail. Those are called terminal bands. And the other birds of prey that we've looked at so far do not have any terminal bands. So when you see a bird with a terminal band, you've automatically been able to dismiss the possibility that it's any of those other Buteos that we looked at. They can have these translucent stained glass windows in the hand, especially when you're looking up at these birds and they're overhead and the sun's just past them. The sunlight almost shines through their parts of their wings and it makes for the stained glass look. And you can compare here, that shape of the wings almost looks butter knife shaped. Here's a red-shouldered hawk at Floyd Lamb, really blending in with some autumn colors. This bird was perched motionless for like about 20 minutes, and no one really seemed to notice it because it was just so still. Young birds, this is a young red-shouldered hawk also at Floyd Lamb, and you can see all that white patterning on the back, and you can see a little bit of those terminal bands on the tail, but it's not that bold black and white look yet. If you look at the picture on the right, you can see a lot of white in that area where you get that stained glass look on the adults. And so those wrists of the birds, the hands of these birds can be quite white. And if you're thinking to yourself that the bird on the right almost looks more accipiter shaped, like a Cooper's hawk or a sharp-shinned hawk, this bird, when it's a juvenile, can look very similar to a juvenile Cooper's hawk. And it is true that on juvenile birds, that their tails and their wings are proportionally larger than that of an adult. And the reason for that is most likely because they need some additional edge, some more lift to help them compensate for the fact that they are less experienced of hunters. And so natural selection has afforded them the ability to get by those tough few months while they're hunting on their own by having a little extra lift, a little extra advantage by having longer tails and longer wing feathers. But when they molt into adult plumage, they will have shorter tails and shorter wings. Far less frequently than any of the other birds that I mentioned, we do get the occasional zone-tailed hawk here in southern Nevada. We're at the very edge of this bird's range. You can get them on the Colorado Plateau. So for those in St. George, you're actually a little bit more likely to run into a zone-tailed hawk than we are here. This is more of a bird of Central America, the Sonoran Desert and the Colorado Plateau, the Mogollon Rim. And this bird looks remarkably like a turkey vulture. It has a dihedral like a turkey vulture. They soar with turkey vultures quite a bit. And this is a bird that relies on its similarity to the turkey vulture, which other birds have come to understand are not a threat. This bird will blend in with the turkey vultures and hang out with them and basically dupe the birds in the area into thinking that it is just a turkey vulture and then it'll make its move. So it's a pretty cool adaptation. They are found all throughout Central America and even into South America. And on this bird, you can see a tail band, that black and white alternation on the tail. And you have on the bill a trace of yellow. I don't know if you can see it all that well, but that yellow is called a sear. And it's a little bit of skin between the eye and the bill. And if you see that yellow sear and that black and white alternation in the tail, you're looking at a zone-tailed hawk, especially if it's a very dark bird with the whitish wings. So that white and black two-toned appearance is very similar to a turkey vulture. This zone-tailed hawk, I took this photo north of Kingman in the Surbat mountain range. They actually breed there. It's really close to to Las Vegas. It's only about 75 miles away, but to get them here is really unusual. There are a couple that live in the springs, it seems. Maybe a pair are seen in the Spring Mountain Range every summer. And Kim Garrison Means, who's on the call, shared this photo with me on the right. This is a zone-tailed hawk coming into a pond on some property in Searchlight, the Mystery Ranch. So there's a trail camp set up at the pond, and a zone-tailed hawk came in. This is in early April. So it probably was hunting around the McCullough Range or anywhere with some pinyon juniper forest and decided to swing by. But this is definitely a bird that likes the mountainous areas of the region. You don't typically get them in open desert. Decided to throw those in the middle of the red-shouldered hawks. But here's a young red-shouldered hawk. You can see a profile of this bird. And you can see how long that tail is, all that streaking running down the breast. For the most part, with a lot of our young birds of prey, this is true for red-shouldered hawks, broadwing hawks, Coopers and sharp-shins. If you see streaking running down the breast, so from the neck all the way down towards the feet, if you see that, that is streaking, and a streaking suggests that you're looking at a young bird. When there's patterning that is running horizontal along the belly of the breast, usually you're looking at an adult bird. And if you look here on the range map on the right, you'll see that this bird is not showing up in Nevada. This is another range map that needs to be updated by the Cornell lab because they are here in Southern Nevada now. Okay, these are tricky birds coming up. So if you're here to hone some of your skills on the Coopers and sharp-shinned hawks, these next few minutes are for you. So we're going to talk about some of our forest hawks, our accipiters. And right here, you're looking at an adult Cooper's hawk on the left, and on the right, you're looking at a young Cooper's hawk with a streaking running down the belly and the breast. And you can see on that juvenile bird a yellow eye. On the Cooper's hawk on the left, you have a sort of like blood red eye. So as they mature, as they get to be a year old, they will lose that yellow eye and they'll get a red eye. And it'll be more slate gray on the back as an adult than a browner young bird. This is going to be the same for a sharp-shinned hawk. Now, structurally, they're quite similar, a juvenile and a adult. By the time that these birds leave their nest, they're pretty much the same size. And what you see on a Cooper's hawk that you won't see on a sharp-shinned hawk is a fairly pronounced neck. You can definitely see that long neck on the Cooper's hawk on the right. And you have a flatter top to the head. A sharp-shinned hawk will have a rounder head. And because the sharp-shinned hawk has a rounder head, the eye looks like it's dead center on that bird's head. Whereas on a Cooper's hawk, it looks like it's more towards the bill and less towards the center. That is because the head shapes of these birds are quite different. They'll use different habitats, or excuse me, they'll use similar habitats, I'm sorry. But the Cooper's hawk will be here year round. They actually breed in the Las Vegas Valley at low elevation. And then sharp-shinned hawks are really only coming into the region during migration or during the wintertime. You can find both of those species anywhere in the city right now for the wintertime. And we actually have a couple of sharp-shinned hawks that breed up in the Spring Mountain Range. Once you get up into Ponderosa Pine at about 7,500 feet and up, you can get sharp-shinned hawks. But if you see any of these birds in the summertime in low-lying areas of Southern Nevada, you're looking at a Cooper's hawk. It's a very urban species of bird. Here's another example. So you can see that red eye, that more orange eye, that flat top to the head, and a pretty pronounced dark cap on this bird. In flight, that's when they tend to pose the most challenges, these Cooper's hawks versus these sharp-shinned hawks. And if you look at this bird's head, it's projecting well beyond its shoulders. You can see that there is a neck to this bird. On a sharp-shinned hawk, and we'll see some photos of them in a little bit, they will not have pronounced necks at all. It'll just look like a tiny little head propped onto a really broad set of wings. And on this Cooper's hawk, I'm also seeing a little bit of white coming out on the sides of the rump. So above the tail, there's a little bit of white. You won't see that on most other birds of prey. For something like a northern harrier, and we'll look at photos of them later, they have much more white along that rump. It actually goes all the way around across the top of the tail. But for a Cooper's hawk, it's just a little fluff flanking the sides of the tail. And that head, you'll take a look at how far beyond the wings and the shoulders that head goes. On a sharp-shinned hawk, which we'll look at in a second, you're not going to see that. So let's look at our sharp-shinned hawk. You might be able to see that it has that smaller head and almost has this beady-eyed look to it. Again, it's a much smaller head, but the eyes are still quite large, so it almost looks like they're popping out of its tiny head. And this bird is on a point A to B mission. It is moving across from one grove of trees to the next at the Henderson Bird Viewing Preserve. It's got these long, broad wings. They're not pointed like on many of our falcons, and you can see that proportionally long tail. Here's a distant one in flight at Clark County Wetlands Park, and you can see a fairly small head, broad inner wings, and a squared tail. And that squared tail is something that a lot of birders will say, look for the tail shape for a determination between Cooper's and sharp-shinned hawk. If you see a squared tail, most likely you're looking at a sharp-shinned hawk, and if it's rounded, it might be a Cooper's hawk, but I found that this is only true about 90% of the time. So it's a good indicator, but not a sure thing. Here's a sharp-shinned hawk perched. This is at Clark County Wetlands Park. You can see what looks like a fairly square tail at the end. Some really beautiful rusty markings going across the breast. They're not streaked, so I know that this is not a young sharp-shinned hawk, and a fairly round head with eyes that sit sort of at the center of the head, unlike a sharp-shinned hawk, which are more towards the much larger bill. And these sharp-shinned hawks, because they have such small round heads and not much of necks, it almost looks like somebody took the head of this bird and just plopped it onto these shoulders, whereas on a Cooper's hawk, it almost looks like they're slouching because they have such long necks. This is my dream photo to capture it, but it's not mine. It was taken off the internet. Somebody named Jay McCowan got it. This is a perfect comparison shot between two very similar birds that cause a lot of confusion. And what I'm showing here with these orange lines is that head projection. Head projection is really helpful to look at on sharp-shinned and Cooper's hawks. So a head projection is really how far beyond the wings the head projects. It's as simple as that. The sharp-shinned hawk is on the left. It's a smaller accipiter, but that can be hard to gauge when you don't have a reference. Here we do have a reference. These two birds are obviously different sizes. The sharp-shinned on the left, and you can see that that head almost kind of sits in a pocket that is created by the shoulders. It's almost as if they're shrugging. You can think of them as a shrugging sharpie, a shrugging sharp-shinned hawk. I have an arrow pointing at the sharp-shinned hawk there on the left, and that is to direct attention to where the tail meets the torso. It gets really thin, almost like it's a pinch point. On a Cooper's hawk, the bird on the right, that bird is a lot more tubular looking, and so it doesn't come to this pinch point and create these hard angles where the tail meets the torso. So you can see this bird on the left, that sharp-shinned hawk. It is there are a lot more sharp angles in that bird's posture and position. It almost looks like a button mushroom that you would cook with, that sharp-shinned hawk. The Cooper's hawk, that head sticks way beyond the wings compared to the sharp-shinned hawk. Much more tubular body, and much more less angular looking wings than a sharp-shinned hawk. And then on the left-hand side, I kind of show a squared off tail, sort of, for that sharp-shinned hawk. Some people will say that a sharp-shinned hawk at some hawk watches looks like a flying mallet. So I put a photo of a mallet on there, and Cooper's hawks are more likened to a flying cross because of how much more head projection there is. So we've gone through our Buteos, and we went through our forest hawks, and now we're moving on to our eagles, our largest birds of prey. They're large and they're powerful. They take many years to achieve mature adult plumage. So a golden eagle will take 4 years to achieve that adult plumage. A bald eagle will take 5 years to achieve that plumage. They can both be found here in southern Nevada, but bald eagles prefer to be around water because they're big time fish eaters. They will take mammals, they will take carrion. Golden eagles will also take carrion, but golden eagles are mostly going after lagomorphs. Lagomorphs are your rabbits and your jackrabbits. About 75% of the diets of golden eagles in Nevada is made up of jackrabbits and desert cottontails. Whereas for bald eagles, they're taking fish, they'll also take waterfowl, they'll take just about anything. Both of them will take just about anything. However, the golden eagles are known to take mammals as large as the fawns of mule deer and bighorn sheep and pronghorns. So that's pretty impressive. You can find these birds at Lake Mead. That's where I tend to see bald eagles the most. Pahranagat, also a great place to see bald eagles. But if you are closer to mountain ranges and the habitat is very arid and open, like sagebrush, chances are you're looking at a golden eagle. We'll take a look at both of those species, but let's look at the golden eagle first. This is not my favorite photo that I've gotten of a golden eagle, but what I do like is that you're able to see that shape really well. And on a golden eagle, you can see that the wings at the tips are kind of swept back a little bit. And the head does not project all that much compared to a bald eagle, but the tail is quite long on a golden eagle. On a bald eagle, you would notice a much larger head sticking out. This bird might be looking down, so you can't get the best idea of how small that head and how small that neck is relative to a bald eagle, but you're able to see the shape of this bird pretty well. You're able to see the length of that fairly squared tail that kind of pinches in towards the feet. And if you remove the tail and the head of this bird, it would almost look like those cheesy mustaches that you can put on, like a costume mustache. It kind of has that shape to it. Whereas a bald eagle, it looks like they have these 2x4 shaped wings that are like planks sticking out from its torso. Here's another golden eagle. Not my photo, but you can see how small the head is relative to the length of the tail. The leading edge of the wing, so the front of the wing, is quite straight, and the trailing edge of the wing kind of bulges out towards the center. These are golden eagles that I got photos of at Lake Mead, or excuse me, not Lake Mead, Red Rock Canyon the other day. It's really distant and grainy, but this is a photo that kind of more illustrates a point rather than awing you with how great the quality of the photo is. And that is that these birds will maintain a territory year-round. These are adult golden eagles. This is probably one of the pairs that nests at Red Rock Canyon, and they will maintain their nesting territory all year long. Oftentimes they won't migrate. So if you see two brown eagles, then you're probably looking at golden eagles maintaining their territory. A bald eagle doesn't achieve that adult plumage, that iconic whitish head and whitish tail and, sort of dark chocolate colored torso and wings until they're 4 or 5 years old. So it can be confusing when you see a young bald eagle. It can look like a golden eagle of any age just based off of the amount of brown. But if you see two birds that look like they're interacting peacefully together in an arid location, even from a distance, and they're brown, you're probably looking at a golden eagle pair maintaining part of their territory. Now here's a bald eagle, and this is a young one. I believe this is a 2-year-old at 33 Hole at Lake Mead. And unlike the golden eagle, they have these large plank 2x4 shaped wings. The head sticks out way more than on a golden eagle. The golden eagle almost has more of a Buteo shape to it. There's nothing like a bald eagle in North America. Big, broad wings that go out perpendicular to the body and go all the way out, kind of like they're flying with 2x4s with these really stiff, strong wing beats. The tail there is kind of wedge shaped, so the inner tail feathers are a little bit they're a little bit longer than the outer tails, and so therefore it gives it this wedge shaped look to it. Here are the two birds side by side.
I know when I started playing that.
And if you are not on mute, kindly please mute yourself. I'm going through the list now and taking care of it. Okay. Here are the two birds side by side. And you can really see now how small the head is of that golden eagle. And the bald eagles tend to have much more mottled coloration on their breast and on their wings. Even on the tail, it's a lot more sort of diffuse colored. Whereas if you look at that golden eagle, it's a lot more clean cut. There's a lot sharper of a distinction between the darks and the light colors on those golden eagles. These two birds, these two bald eagles of varying ages. These photos were taken over in Lake Cocosino in northern Arizona a couple years ago. And you can really see a size difference here between that juvenile bald eagle on the right and a red-tailed hawk. And if you look closely at the bird on the right as well, that young red-tailed hawk, or excuse me, that young bald eagle, you can see a band on its left leg. So that was a bird that was banded and currently being monitored, probably to track its movements and its health. So now we're moving past our bald eagles and our golden eagles and to our osprey. There's only one species of osprey in the world. It is a cosmopolitan species, meaning that it's found pretty much worldwide. It is found on 6 continents. I bet you can guess which continent it is not found on. It's the continent that most birds are not found on, but the birds on that continent are pretty unique and pretty cool. And the osprey is a very long-winged bird of prey that specializes on fish, has some pretty cool adaptations for capturing fish. So it's got very long claws, and they are able to dive into the water, talons first, and grab fish that are just below the surface, and they can take off from the surface of the water. So they're quite light, and so they can take off and not get bogged down and drowned in the habitats that they catch their prey in. And they always have an angular shape to their wrists coming down towards the feathers. They almost look like a squished M. So if you were to take the letter M or W for that matter, and you compressed it, you squished it in, you would get this M shape to it. And if you look in the bird on the right, you can really see that dark band that runs from the back of the eye towards the back of the neck. Because this bird is living its life in very open environments, sometimes on the ocean or on a lake, over at Lake Mead or somewhere far away from tree cover, it's getting a lot of sunlight, and it's also facing the reflections of surface water. And it's kind of like a adaptation. That plumage there, that dark bar, is akin to like say a baseball player who will get that smudgy dark underneath the eye to help them be able to see what's going on in a baseball game better. This is the same idea. It's a pretty cool adaptation. You can see that squished M look as the bird is in a glide, like that bird on the left, or that picture on the left. And then on the right-hand side, this is another look at that osprey. Always has this black and white look to it, very long-winged and long-tailed. Always has that white band running across the eye and the back of the head, and almost always around water. All right, we're getting a little bit towards the end here. We've gone through our Buteos, which include the red-tailed hawks. We've gone through our sharp-shinned and our Coopers. We've gone through our eagles, our osprey. Now we have our falcons and then our harrier, and then we'll start to wind down. Falcons, they're actually more related to parrots than they are your hawks. And that's only a recent finding, a recent understanding. This is one of those things where now that we can sequence the DNA of these birds quite easily, you know, like any of us can go get a 23andMe right now and we can figure out what our genome is. That's pretty cool. It's also really affordable. Maybe like 15 or 20 years ago, that would have cost millions of dollars to do. Well, now scientists are able to sequence the genomes of pretty much all animals, and it's way less expensive. And that's really changed the way that scientists really understand and define what these species are. And they're seeing that birds and other animals that were thought to be related to one another, they're actually not that related. And it's actually found that falcons and parrots can do something really similar to one another, and that is actually take something, hold it in their talons, and bring it up, twisting it at the joint up to their mouth. So that's something that falcons can do and parrots can do, but most other birds cannot do. So when I heard that a couple years ago, it about blew my mind. When you see falcons display, they'll do these really shallow, fast wing beats. It looks really similar to parrots. And after it was pointed out to me, I see some other similarities in them. But unlike parrots, the falcons are pretty much bird and bat specialists. Kestrels and some of the other falcons will go after insects too, but they're pretty much made for cutting through the sky and catching things in the air. That's what they're really good at doing. And here in Las Vegas, we have lots of American kestrels. We have many more here in the wintertime, but we do have some that spend the summers here. They're cavity nesters, so they're nesting in tiny holes. This bird is about robin-sized, so it's a very tiny falcon. They'll take small lizards, they'll take small reptiles and small rodents, but they're mostly going after things like dragonflies and butterflies, large moths, certainly lots of grasshoppers. We had a big boom of the pennant-winged grasshoppers here this summer after the monsoons passed by, and the kestrels, I'm sure, were very excited about it. So 2 more photos of these birds in flight, and you can really see, like most falcons, they have these really long, thin tails and long angular wings. And you have what looks like a female falcon on the left, and on the right, I believe that this is a young one. And I took the photo on the right over in the Weethump Wilderness a couple weeks ago, and the bird on the left is in Las Vegas over near Summerlin. And it got a little wonky, it looks like, on that bird on the right, but I have these lines that are running along the wings. So one of the birds that you can easily mistake the kestrel with is the merlin. It's another species of falcon that we're going to look at next. But what I did on this bird here on the right-hand side is I traced the back of the wing to show you the angle of that bird. It's got these really sort of banana peel shaped wings to the bird. I know that that's really subjective and probably a weird comparison, but compared to other falcons, it has these really slim angled wings. And where you see that more orange line running from the tip of the wing all the way to the torso, on any of the other falcons, you would see that wing extend out to there. So that's sort of like a imaginary line of where the wing would be on some of these other falcons. So this is an instance where shape is really helpful in getting to know these birds. Kestrels tend to be a lot more, unlike a merlin, they float a little bit more like a butterfly as they're flying. They're usually a lot less purposeful than other falcons, and they get moved around by the wind quite a bit. They're really light, and so when they're flying from A to B, they're kind of flapping like a butterfly and getting moved around by the wind, so moving side to side. Something like a merlin, which is only just a little bit bigger and a little bit stronger, flies much more purposefully. So it's not getting moved around when it's going A to B. It is on a mission. And part of it has to do with the larger surface areas of the wings. It allows it to control its movement a lot more than a kestrel. So here's your merlin. This bird is maybe like 1 inch longer than a kestrel. But when you see this bird flying from A to B, it basically looks like it had like 3 shots of espresso and is listening to like heavy metal, like death metal. It is just cruising. These birds have a lot of attitude and they mean business. Even though they're quite small, they're almost always the bird that is around, like asserting itself. It's like a really small dog that just has to go around letting everyone else know how tough it is. That's the merlin. They always present as very dark in plumage, especially compared to a kestrel, which might have a lot of more orange tones to it. So you can see on these kestrels, there's a lot of orange. And again, look at these kestrels, very thin, sort of banana peel shaped, those birds. And on the right-hand side, you can see how angular those wings are. This bird, it looks like they have more cutting knife shaped wings, and that helps them live their lives with a lot more intention than a kestrel. Our third species of falcon, I actually saw one of these today with Morrigan at one of our beginning birding events at Pittman Wash. And these birds can be found about anywhere, anytime in the desert, sagebrush and creosote, Joshua tree forest. And they also do come into the city from time to time. They usually have this sort of sandy brown, sort of milk chocolate cast to their backs. So you can really see that on the right-hand side, that really long tail, long angular wings that are really, unique to the falcons. That bird is in a stoop. That bird on the right, it's diving on something near the pond at Corn Creek. And the bird on the left, this is a photo taken in Utah. And look at those dark armpits. So just under the wing, you have a pretty appreciable amount of dark. And those are the armpits. The technical term are the axillaries, but you can think of them as dark struts too, like struts in a car, and they're supporting the wings of the bird. You can see those even from a far distance. So when you see the dark armpits and you believe that you're looking at a falcon, even if you can't see the brown of the bird, you're probably looking at a prairie falcon. Now, the prairie falcon is about the same size as a peregrine falcon, but it's just a little bit slimmer. And if you start to see peregrine falcons and prairie falcons, you might notice those size similarities, but you'll hopefully with some practice you'll start to notice that they are a slimmer bird. There's an arrow pointing to the dark axillaries, the struts, the armpits. Here's your peregrine falcon, another cosmopolitan species found on 6 continents, not found in Antarctica. This is a bird that is known to be the fastest animal in the world. That is because when they dive from a high point in the sky, they turn themselves essentially into a bullet or a missile. That is the way that they are shaped, and they can clock speeds of about 200 miles an hour. Some people say more, but conservatively about 200 miles an hour. They've got these black helmets. Those helmets are a lot thicker than on the prairie falcon, so I'll go back to the prairie falcon. You can see that bird on the left. It looks more like a little tiny mustache coming down from behind the bill and towards the throat, just a little mustache. Well, this bird is wearing a helmet. It's a lot more dark in that face than on a prairie falcon. I saw one of these today in the afternoon, flying around. I was on a run in the afternoon, and I just had one in the neighborhood, just cruising by. They are large and in charge. They're fast, angular, and you can find them pretty much any habitat in the Mojave Desert, especially if there are cliffs around and buildings. I actually found out recently that a couple of them breed at the Mandalay Bay on the Strip. So they're an urban bird too, with these cutting knife, these kitchen knife shaped wings. All right, we're getting towards the end here. This is one of our last birds that we'll take a look at, which is great because I see that I have just a few minutes left. Here's our northern harrier. This is a bird species that has very long wings and a very long tail. The head shape is very unique. They have these disc-shaped wings, and that is disc-shaped faces, and that is because they hunt a lot more like some of the owls, like a barn owl or a short-eared owl, where because they're floating low over a grassy area or a marsh, they're actually doing a lot more listening than other birds of prey. And like an owl, that disc shape will allow sound of something in a marsh, like a rodent moving around, or maybe a sparrow, a red-winged blackbird. Anything moving around in the grasses is going to make that noise. And that noise gets funneled in by specialized feathers on the head. And that noise gets directed towards the ears. So they have really good hearing. And these are ambush predators. And unlike some of these other birds that I mentioned earlier, the northern harriers are hunters. Whenever you see a bird sort of moving around an area, especially low, and it looks like it's actively hunting, you might be looking at a harrier. They spend barely any time hanging out, just sort of looking like they're doing nothing. Most of your harrier sightings are going to be a bird that is actively hunting. Compare the wing shapes of the peregrine falcon on the right-hand side and that harrier on the left. You can probably see that the peregrine falcon on the right has those cutting knife shaped wings, whereas this harrier, they're more tubular looking, and the primary feathers, so these feathers that kind of come out towards the very ends of the wings, these are the primaries, they're a little bit shorter towards the top of the wing, so that leading edge, whereas in the peregrine falcon, they're kind of bunched together, and that makes the wings look differently. And they've evolved this way because they hunt very differently. Some looks at your northern harriers here. So the birds on the left and the center, these are the same ones. These are male northern harriers with these gray casts to them. The bird on the right, that's a female northern harrier with a lot of streaking, not a lot of rusty colors. Whereas if I go back just a little bit, this bird on the right that looks very rusty or has these copper colors, that is a juvenile bird. So a juvenile, both sexes of males and females will have those copper colors, whereas a female adult and the adult males have these grayish casts to them. And one of the best field marks on a northern harrier is this white rump. So between the tail and the back, that white area is so diagnostic. I showed you a Cooper's hawk earlier, and a Cooper's hawk has those white flanks, but Northern Harrier has those white flanks. There's some really great resources out there. These are some guides that are put out by Humana. So that's your Hawk Migration Association of North America. I believe that you can buy these, and these show you the different shapes and the different sizes of these birds. So a lot of the things that we went over today, but you can see, again, like a red-shouldered hawk, it looks like it's reaching forward with those big baseball mitts for hands, whereas something like a peregrine falcon has those kitchen knife shaped wings. And then a red-tailed hawk here, you can see the wings bulge into the tail. So there's some really great resources. I wish that I could find a way to get one done for over here, but I don't have those artistic skills yet, at least. But I geek out on this stuff big time. So practice, 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 everyone. That about concludes the lecture. But a lot of this is not really going to make too much sense until you get out there and you put it all into practice. And there's some great hawk watching, falcon watching opportunities all over southern Nevada and the Mojave Desert right now, because it's wintertime. And so we have kestrels and peregrine prairie falcons in Las Vegas right now, lots of Coopers and sharp-shinned hawks in Las Vegas right now. Not a lot of Merlins. If you go to Clark County Wetlands Park, you're bound to run into Harriers. If you go to Lake Mead, you might run into ospreys or bald eagles. And if you go into the Spring Mountains, the Sheep Range, or up towards St. George, you might run into some golden eagles, and red-tailed hawks can be just about anywhere. So, hey, I hope that you enjoyed this. I see some things coming into the chat, so I will stop sharing and look at, so I'm looking for questions. I see some thank yous from Tanya. Tanya, I'm so glad that you could make it. I know it's late over there in Florida. Jess, I'm glad you can make it too. Jess Brooks from Endow just moved up to Reno, so we lost her in southern Nevada, but we hope to see her again soon. Thank you, Kathy and Darlene, Jennifer. Thank you. Kathy Klein, you're welcome. Go find a golden eagle. Luana and Nick, always a pleasure to have you here. Paul, I see your note there. I'll give you a ring. Oh yeah, so Paul and Colleen Hicks, they want to remind us that there is a St. George Audubon, so Red Cliffs Audubon. They have a raptor field trip north of St. George. I heard that place is bananas for birds of prey in the wintertime. So it's probably about a 3.5-hour drive from here, but it's supposed to be very good. I'd love to make that. Ooh, Darlene Pope had a golden eagle in the neighborhood. You don't have to tell us where you live, Darlene, but if you do want to share, I'd be curious to know whereabouts you had it. Kim Garrison, okay. Oh, Darlene had a golden eagle near Zion. Yeah, that tracks. They love that cliffy habitat. Oh, okay. So Kim asks, what are the most frequent raptors in Joshua Tree woodlands? I would say the red-tailed hawk is your most common bird of prey year-round. And then I see a lot of kestrels, especially in your neck of the woods. I get American kestrels quite frequently in like the Wee Thump area, Walking Box, and they breed in yuccas and Joshua trees, especially in old flicker holes. So they'll go find anywhere that a flicker has excavated, and occupy a vacant flicker nest, because they're cavity nesters. So the flicker and the ladder-backed woodpeckers, pretty much all woodpeckers, are super important in the desert because they're making nesting areas for so many other species. So I'd say the red-tailed hawk, the kestrel, prairie falcons, I get them out there too. And then like in the McCullough Range and the North New Yorks, the Paiutes, pretty much all of those have golden eagles. If there's any vertical cliff, you have plenty of golden eagles. And usually they, like, once you get about 3 miles away from one nest, now you can find perhaps another nest if there's appropriate habitat, but they rarely will be within 3 miles of one another if there's a line of sight, if they can see each other. Now, if they're on either side of a big tall mountain and they never know that the other pair's there, well, that's a different type of scenario. Other than that, yeah, you have your great horned owls, a couple burrowing owls. Thinking here, northern harriers will pass through, and of course the occasional zone-tailed hawk, but not to be expected.
Thanks, Alex.
Yeah, you're welcome. Oh, Paul says that they get the common black hawk near the Lytle Ranch in the summer. Yeah, so we don't get a bird species that they get in St. George and the Zion area, but there's the common black hawk from Central America. Carolina, who's tuning in from Mexico City, might have seen a couple black hawks, but some parts of the western Colorado Plateau and even Arizona, they get common black hawks in those cottonwoods. We had one a couple of years ago. It was just swing by for like one day. It roosted in the Las Vegas Wash, where the habitat's really good, but people didn't find it. And I think that at Pranigat, there might have been a successful pair for a couple of years, but they moved on. Carolina asks, have I seen harpy eagles? Yes, I have. I've seen, my first one was in Peru in the Amazon. That was in like 2010. And then when I was in Brazil, I was working in Brazil for a couple months in the Amazon, and I saw them a couple times. And I think I was telling Morrigan about the harpy eagle the other day, but that bird commands so much authority over the rainforest. It's incredible. I remember being up on a canopy tower that was like 80 meters high. It was super high, maybe not 80 meters. That sounds too high. But it was over the canopy of the trees, and I could see out over this primary rainforest. And when the harpy eagle calls, and it happened to call while I was up there, it's a really high-pitched call, but all the birds and the monkeys in the forest know what it sounds like. And everything just went silent, but not before just like all the monkeys and the macaws just started making a bunch of noise. Like the macaws flew in the opposite direction of the sound and like never came back. And then it got quiet. And then I started looking around and eventually saw this harpy eagle sitting on a branch over the river. Amazing. Yeah. For those of you on the call that don't know about the harpy eagle, it's one of the biggest birds of prey in the world. And they specialize on feeding on monkeys and sloths. So they go after really big prey, and they'll take macaws too. So pretty much every animal that lives in a tree in the rainforest, from about Costa Rica all the way down into the Amazon, they don't mess with harpy eagles. They don't take any chances. So, okay, well, it's getting late, and I want to honor this the 7:45 cutoff time, and it's 7:50. So thanks everyone. Thanks. I'll hang out for a little bit because some of you I know that I don't get to see all that often.
Thanks, Alex.
Thanks, Alex.
Yeah, Paul, I'll get in touch with you soon. You're welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
What a treat.
Thank you, Alex.
Bye-bye. Hey, Jeff,
Thank you.
Lana, Lindsay, later. Thank you, Morrigan. What's up, Carolina? How you doing?
I'm doing great, and you?
Good. Let me stop recording. Hold on. Let me figure this out.